when they decided to become man and wife. And that was a generous openness to peoples and cultures beyond the ones in which they were raised. My mother learned this, I think, as much as anything else from her parents, one of whom was mentioned, who had friends in many continents, including India, at a time when many English people were extremely provincial. One of the reasons my grandfather was involved in negotiating Indian independence was that he'd been the friend of Nehru's for a very long time, for 15 years before the negotiations. My father, I think, learned it from Kumasi, which, like many old capital cities, the city where I was raised, is a polyglot, multicultural place open to the world. But he learned it too from his schooling, because if you had the opportunity to get a secondary school education in the far-flung reaches of the British Empire in the 1930s, as he did, but many people didn't, but if you did, you were educated in the classics. My father loved Latin. By his bedside he kept not only his Bible, but works by Cicero and Marcus Aurelius, followers both of the sort of Stoicism that was central to the intellectual and moral life of the Roman Republic by the 1st century, when Christianity was beginning to spread through the Hellenistic world of the Eastern Empire. In his spiritual testament to us, his children, my father told us that we should always remember that we were citizens of the world. He used those exact words, words that Marcus Aurelius would have recognized and agreed with. Marcus Aurelius, after all, wrote, "How close is the kinship between a man and the whole human race, for it is a community not of a little blood or seed, but of the spirit." Now, what I want to talk about today briefly is cosmopolitanism, a Stoic philosophical ideal, which is one expression of that openness to others that I learned first from my family. An ideal that I think can help guide the global community through the years ahead. But I want to begin by saying that I don't think my parents would have found it so easy and natural to believe in this old ideal. As I say, the city we hadn't lived in had not itself been so deeply cosmopolitan. When I was a child, we got our rice from Irani brothers. Yes, you guessed it, they were from Persia. And we often stopped in on various Lebanese and Syrian families, Muslim and Maronite, and even a philosophical Druze named Mr. Honey, who sold imported cloth and probably smuggled diamonds, and who was always ready, as I grew older, for a conversation about the troubles of his native Lebanon. There were other strangers among us too. In the military barracks in the centre of town, you could find many people from the north of the country, especially among the other ranks, privates and NCOs. Their faces often sketched in distinctive patterns of ethnic scarification. And then there were the occasional Europeans, the Greek architect who designed my parents' house, some English barristers and judges, an Irish doctor, there's always an Irish doctor, a Scots engineer, there's always a Scots engineer, and a wildly international assortment of professors at the university from Russia and Czechoslovakia and the United States and Britain and Australia, many of whom, unlike the colonial officials, remained after independence. I never thought to wonder, as a child, why these people travelled so far to live and work in my hometown. Seemed like a good place to me, but we were glad that they were there. Cosmopolitanism is an ideal that's particularly useful when we're faced with the sorts of conflicts grounded in religious, ethnic, racial, and national identity which pervade the modern world. I grew up in a place and time where the diversity of our city was not a source of conflict because of the openness of its cosmopolitan inhabitants. As it happens, the word cosmopolitan comes to us from the classical West. Its etymology is Greek, even though the man who coined the term came, like so many of the traditions of the West, from Asia Minor. But though I shall be discussing these Western roots a little bit, we can be confident that this ideal, or something very like it, was independently invented in other continents and at other times. I doubt Kumasi's cosmopolitanism came from a careful reading of the Stoics, and I'll return to this point at the end. So, the earliest figure we know, who said he was a citizen of the world, a cosmopolites in Greek, which is where our word comes from, was a man called Diogenes. He was a philosopher, though everybody then was a philosopher, not they? And he was the founder in particular of the movement that's called Cynicism, which I like to say is not the official philosophy of the American high school, but something antedated born sometime in the late 5th century in Sinope on the southern coast of the Black Sea in what is now Turkey. The Cynics rejected tradition and local loyalty and generally opposed what everybody else thought of as civilized behavior. Diogenes himself lived, tradition reports, in a large terracotta pot. It is said that he did what my English nanny would have called his business in public. And if you don't know what my English nanny would have called his business, she certainly wouldn't want me to tell you. He also did what Hugh Hefner made his business in public too. So he was a sort of 4th century BCE performance artist. And he was called a cynic, kines in Greek means doggy, because he lived like a dog. So the cynics are just the doggy philosophers. It's no wonder that he was kicked out of Sinope. But as I say, for better or worse, he's also the first person who's reported to have said he was a citizen of the world. Now that's a metaphor, of course, because citizens, a polites is someone who shares a polis with other people. And there was no world state, there was no cosmopolis for Diogenes to be a citizen of, and there isn't now. So like anyone who adopts this metaphor, he had to decide how to make it work, what to mean by it. One thing Diogenes didn't mean was that he favoured a single world government. He once met someone who did, Alexander of Macedon, Alexander the Great, who favoured, as you know, government of the world by Alexander of Macedon. The story goes that Alexander came across Diogenes one sunny day, it's important that it was sunny, this time not in the terracotta pot for some reason, but in a hole in the ground, for that day seemed more comfortable for him. The Macedonian world conqueror, who as a student of Aristotle's had been brought up to respect philosophers, asked Diogenes if there was anything he could do for him. And Diogenes' famous reply was, "Sure, you can get out of my light. You're standing between me and the sun." So Diogenes was clearly not a fan of Alexander, or we may suppose of his project of global domination. And this must have upset Alexander, by the way, because one of the sayings of Alexander that has come down to us is, "If I hadn't been Alexander, I would have liked to be Diogenes." So this must have been a very disappointing day in the life of the great world conqueror to finally meet his philosophical hero and to be dismissed for getting in the way of the sun. So that's the first thing I'd like to take from Diogenes. In interpreting the metaphor of global citizenship, we can take that metaphor seriously without being committed to world government, even world government by Aristotle's most famous student, at least his most famous non-philosophical student. We can think of ourselves as fellow citizens, even if we aren't and don't want to be, members of a single sovereign political community, subject to a single sovereign government. The second idea we can borrow from Diogenes is that we should care about the fate of all our fellow human beings, not just the ones in our own literal polis, our own community. Just as within your community you should care about every one of your fellow citizens, so in the world as a whole you have to care about your fellow world citizens, all the other humans that there are. And furthermore, this is the third thing we can take from Diogenes, you can borrow good ideas from all over the world, not just from at home. It's worth listening to others because they may have something to teach us, and it's worth their listening to us because they may have something to learn. We don't have any writings from Diogenes, partly I suspect, because like Socrates, he believed that conversation, which goes both ways, in which you learn as well as teach, was a better way of communicating than writing messages to people who can't answer back, which is, after all, what a book is. That's a final thing. Of course, you can answer back to a book, but only with another book. That's a final thing, as we can see in this building. So there's a final thing I want to borrow from Diogenes, the idea that conversation is a fundamental mode of human activity and deeply worthwhile. So these three ideas, I, a 21st century citizen of Anglo-Ghanaian ancestry, American citizen of Anglo-Ghanaian ancestry, want to borrow from a citizen of Sinope who dreamed of global citizenship 24 centuries ago. One, we don't need a single world government, but two, we must nevertheless care for the fate of all human beings inside and outside our own societies. And three, we have much to gain from conversation with one another across our differences. Now, Diogenes' cosmopolitanism entered Western intellectual history through the Stoics, as I said. Diogenes was very influential, exercised great influence on Zeno of Citium, who was conventionally said to be the first Stoic. And cosmopolitanism, as Diogenes understood it, with its openness to foreigners without embracing world government, is found in the greatest of the Stoics. Cicero in the Roman Republic in the 1st century, first century BC, for example, and Marcus Aurelius, the 2nd century, get what we say these days, AD, CE, Roman emperor, at the start, one of my father's, as I said, one of my father's favorite authors. If anyone should have believed in world government, it was these Roman rulers of the world. But Aurelius talked about cosmopolitanism, as we saw, to insist on the spiritual affinity of all human beings, not to argue for a global empire. Through people like Cicero and Aurelius and Epictetus, Stoicism entered the intellectual life of Christianity, despite the fact that Aurelius spent a lot of energy executing Christians because they were a threat to the Roman Republic. Those of you who saw the movie Gladiator will recall Marcus Aurelius sending Christians to the lions. Those of you who have a good classical education will remember it too without seeing the movie. You can hear these Stoic echoes in the language of the Greek-speaking Saul of Tarshish, another town in Asia Minor and what is now southern Turkey. Saul was a Hellenized Jew and a Roman citizen, known to history, of course, as St. Paul, the first great institutional architect of the Christian church. And in his epistle to the Galatians, he wrote famously, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus." Much of St. Paul's evangelism took place in Asia Minor, where he was born. One of my favourite facts is that Sinope, Diogenes' hometown, is in Galatia. So when St. Paul wrote those very cosmopolitan words, he was actually writing to Diogenes' people, to the people who gave the world the first known cosmopolitan. So when the idea of cosmopolitanism was taken up again in the European Enlightenment, and now including 1,000 or so years of very interesting intellectual history, including the history of cosmopolitanism in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, but when it was taken up again in the Enlightenment, it had the same core. Global concern for humanity, without a wish for a world government. Modern cosmopolitanism grew with modern nationalism, not as an alternative to, but as a complement to it. This is a fact of intellectual history that seems to be not sufficiently widely appreciated. The intellectual origins of modern cosmopolitanism, the reformulation of cosmopolitanism in the Enlightenment, was done by the very same people who articulated the intellectual foundations of modern nationalism and the idea of the nation state. And they did not think that they were, as it were, inventing on the one hand, undoing with the one hand what they had done with the other. They thought these two things were compatible. In fact, they thought they were necessary to one another. So, as I say, it grew not as an alternative to, but as a complement to nationalism. And at its heart, not just the idea of universality, concern for all humanity as fellow citizens, but also the value of different human ways of going on. That's why it doesn't go with world government. Because different communities are entitled to live according to different standards, because human beings can flourish in many different kinds of society, and because there are so many values worth living by, and nobody and no single society can explore them all. We find cosmopolitanism, for example, in Herder, the great philosopher of German Romanticism and German nationalism. Herder believed that the German-speaking peoples were entitled to live together in a single political community, which of course they didn't in his day. But he also saw that what was good for the Germans was good for everyone else. And so, unlike many Germans of his day, he believed in the political self-determination of the peoples of Europe, indeed, of all the people of the world. And of course, you find cosmopolitanism famously in Immanuel Kant's Plan for Perpetual Peace, which was the place where the idea of a League of Nations originates, which of course is the idea that led to the creation of the United Nations after the Second World War. Cosmopolitans then are universalists. We believe that every human being matters and that we have a shared obligation to care for one another, but it also accepts that there's a wide range of legitimate human diversity. And that respect for diversity goes back to something that we can also find in Diogenes. It's a kind of tolerance for other people's ideas about how to live, their choices they make for themselves, and also humility about what we ourselves know, not assuming that we are always going to turn out to be right and the other guys are always going to turn out to be wrong. Conversation across identities, across religions, races, ethnicities, and nationalities is worthwhile, Because through conversation, you can learn from people with different, even incompatible ideas from your own. And it's worthwhile too, because if you accept that you live in a world with many different kinds of people, and you're going to live in respectful peace with them, then you need to understand each other, whether or not you come to agreement. Now, globalization, it's a weasel word, but I'll use it anyway. Globalization has made this ancient ideal relevant, which it really wasn't in the days of Diogenes, of Cynic, or Marcus Aurelius. Because there are two obvious conditions on making this idea of citizenship real. One is that you have to know about the lives of the other citizens, and the other is that you have to have some capacity to affect them, some power to affect your fellow citizens. And Diogenes didn't know about most people in China and Japan and South America and Equatorial Africa, even in Western or Northern Europe. And nothing he did was likely to have much impact on them as far as he knew either. And as I say, you can't give real meaning to the idea that we're all fellow citizens if we can't affect each other and we don't know about each other. But we don't live in Diogenes' world. In the last few centuries, as every human community has gradually been drawn into a single web of trade and global network of information, we've come to a point where each of us can realistically imagine contacting any other of our 6 billion or so fellow humans and sending that person something worth having. A cell phone, say, or an antiretroviral drug, or a good idea. Unfortunately, we can now also send, through negligence as much as malice, things that will cause harm. We can send an avian flu virus, or an airborne pollutant, or, perhaps worst of all, a bad idea. And the possibilities of good and ill are multiplied beyond measure when it comes to policies carried out by governments in our name. Together, we can ruin poor farmers in Asia by dumping our subsidized grain into their markets. We can cripple industries with punitive tariffs in Thailand and deliver weapons that will kill thousands upon thousands in places I do not need to name. Together, we can raise living standards, on the other hand, by adopting new policies on trade and on aid. We can prevent or treat diseases with vaccines and pharmaceuticals and good public health. We can take measures against global climate change and environmental pollution. And we can encourage resistance to tyranny and a concern for the worth of each human life. And of course, the World Wide Web of information, the radio, the television, telephones, the web, mean not only that we can affect lives everywhere, but also that we can learn about life anywhere too. Well, each person you know about and can affect is someone to whom you have responsibilities. That's just to affirm the very idea of morality. So the challenge is to take minds and hearts formed over the long millennia of living in local groups and equip us with ideas and institutions that will allow us to live together as the global tribe we've now become. Cosmopolitanism is this double-standard tradition. The slogan, it is universality plus difference. Now, I've already hinted at why cosmopolitans accept, indeed often celebrate, the wide range of legitimate human diversity, but I want to be more explicit about some of the reasons for this. Why, after all, shouldn't we not do, in the name of universal concern, what missionaries, well-intentioned missionaries of many faiths have done? Why shouldn't we go out into the world, guided by the truth, and help others to live by it too? Well, one reason, as I said, is that cosmopolitans inherit from our Greek forebears a recognition of the fallibility of human claims to knowledge. That's the humility I mentioned earlier. Cosmopolitanism begins with the philosophical doctrine of fallibilism, the recognition that we may be mistaken, even when we've looked carefully at the evidence and applied our highest mental capacities. A fallibilist knows that he or she is likely to make mistakes about many things. Of course, we have views, and we take our own views seriously, but we're always open to the possibility that it may turn out that we're wrong. But there's a second reason for this celebration of difference, one whose roots are in a more modern idea, and that's the idea that each human individual is charged with ultimate responsibility for his or her own life. The dignity of each human being resides in part in our shared capacity for, and right to, self-management, which includes the right to figure out how to meet the legitimate moral demands of other people and to work in company with them to pursue our projects. Because of this, it's important that human beings live by standards they themselves believe in, even if the standards are wrong. And because cosmopolitanism is fallibilist, cosmopolitan conversation across cultural and political and social and economic and religious boundaries is not about wholesale conversion. It's about learning, as I said, as well as teaching. It's about listening as well as talking. Even when I'm trying to persuade someone that what they see as right is wrong, I'm also hearing their arguments that what I think is wrong is right. Now, perhaps all this seems to you entirely uncontroversial, banal even, but there are certainly enemies of cosmopolitanism all around. Cosmopolitanism is universality plus difference, as I said. And that means that cosmopolitans have two kinds of enemies. Those who deny the legitimacy of universality, and those who deny the legitimacy of difference. The first kind of enemy, the enemies of universality, often reject the demand for universality in the name of nationalism. Patriots often complain that cosmopolitanism undermines our proper loyalty to our own country. But this misunderstands what the cosmopolitan is saying, or at least the kind of cosmopolitan that I'm representing. We recognize that our own nations make more demands of us than does the human community, just as our families make more demands of us than our nations. To say that every human matters is not to deny that some people matter more to each of us than others. Some American Christians send money to suffering fellow Christians in southern Sudan. Writers, through PEN International, campaign for the freedom of other writers imprisoned around the world. Women in Sweden work for the rights of women in the Punjab. Indians in the Punjab worry about the fate of Punjabis in Canada and Britain. Jews in many nations care about the fate of Israel. To insist on universality is to say that every human being has certain minimum entitlements, many of them, I think, adequately expressed in the language of human rights, and that it is also the obligation of every human being to do his or her fair share in making sure that everybody gets what they're entitled to. It's not easy, of course, in practice to say what the minimum entitlements are, or to say what our fair share is. But the cosmopolitan insists that you should ask yourself, am I doing my fair share to make sure everyone on the planet has the chance at a dignified human existence that everyone is entitled to? A patriot will want to do more than this minimum for her fellow countrymen and women. The cosmopolitan is only insisting that you cannot do less than this for the rest of humankind. But there's another kind of enemy that we need to respond to. These objectors share our belief, our cosmopolitan belief in universality, but they don't care, as cosmopolitans do, for difference. One such kind of cosmopolitan group is made up of the new fundamentalists who pose one of the most serious threats to cosmopolitan cohabitation today. They certainly believe in the universality of their faith. Nothing would make them happier than the conversion of all of humanity. Well, one distinctively cosmopolitan commitment, which is different from their view, is to a kind of pluralism. Cosmopolitans think that there are many values worth living by, and that you can't live by all of them. So we hope and expect that different people in different societies will embody different values, though they have to be values worth living by. And of course, our fallibilism means that, unlike the fundamentalist, we accept that our knowledge is imperfect, provisional, and subject to revision in the face of new evidence. The neo-fundamentalist conception of a global ummah, the conception that guides al-Qaeda, admits, to be sure, of local variations, but only in matters that don't matter. These counter-cosmopolitans, like many Christian and Hindu fundamentalists, do think that there's one best way for all humans to live, and that all the differences must be in the details. Join us, the counter-cosmopolitans say, and we will all be sisters and brothers. But each of them plans to trample on us and our differences if we will not join them. Their motto might as well be that wonderful sardonic German saying, "Und willst du nicht mein Bruder sein, so schlage ich dir den Schädel ein. If you don't want to be my brother, I'll smash your skull in." For the counter-cosmopolitans then, universalism issues in uniformity. The cosmopolitan may often be happy to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but cosmopolitans care if those others don't want to be done unto as we would want to be done unto. It's not necessarily the end of the matter, but it's something we think we need to take account of. Our understanding of toleration means interacting on terms of respect with those who see the world differently. We cosmopolitans think we might learn something even from those we disagree with. We think people have a right to their own lives. For the counter-cosmopolitan, there is no place for curiosity about the ways of the unbeliever. All we are is embodiments of error. Now, to insist on these points is emphatically not to argue that Islam, or for that matter, Christianity or Judaism or religion in general, is intrinsically anti-cosmopolitan. Over the last 2 centuries, one can identify distinguished Islamic thinkers who have engaged seriously with ideas from outside Islam. In the 19th century, Sayyid Ahmed Khan in India and Muhammad Abdu in Egypt both sought to develop Muslim visions of modernity. More recently, Mahmoud Muhammad Taha in Sudan, who was executed for his efforts, Tariq Ramadan in Europe, and the Bush administration denies entry to his country, and Khalid Abdul Fadl in the United States, have all developed their views in dialogue with the non-Muslim world. These Muslim thinkers, I picked pretty much at random, are wildly different, but each of them challenges the fundamentalist conception of Sharia. Ahmed Al-Tayeb, president of Al-Azhar, the world's oldest Muslim university, and despite the fact that our university is 800 years old, in fact, it's the oldest university, period. Cambridge is only 800 years old, but Al-Azhar is older. The president of Al-Azhar has invited the Archbishop of Canterbury to speak from his pulpit. And he has said, God created diverse peoples. Had he wanted to create a single ummah, he would have. But he chose to make people different until the day of resurrection. Every Muslim must fully understand this principle. A relationship based on conflict is futile. Now, I am not saying that I have the right to say what is true and false in Islam. I don't care very much when Muslim intellectuals tell me what's correct in Christianity. It's up to those who want to sail under the flags of Christianity or of Islam to determine and explain, if they wish to, what their banners mean. That is their fight. But among those who call themselves Muslims, there are more tolerant exponents, and there have been more tolerant times. We can observe the historical fact that there have been societies that called themselves Muslim and practiced toleration, including in the very earliest period under the command of the Prophet himself. So it is heartening that there are now many Muslim voices speaking for religious toleration and arguing for it from within the interpretive traditions of Islam. Modern religious fundamentalism, whether Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist or Hindu, is exactly that, modern. And each of these world traditions does indeed have extremely anti-cosmopolitan versions, as indeed does Marxism, the great secular ideology of the modern world. But they have all also existed in cosmopolitan forms. Fallibilist, I was reading something today, I can't remember by someone who pointed out how very much more often religious people express doubts about religion than atheists express doubts about atheism. The history of faith is, as somebody once said, also the history of doubt. So all of these world traditions have existed in fallibilist, pluralist forms, committed to conversation across differences, recognizing the ultimate responsibility of individuals for their own lives. This is not an argument against religion, it's an argument against anti-cosmopolitanism in religion. That Islam in particular is compatible with cosmopolitanism is no more surprising than that Christianity should be. Both, after all, draw on the same philosophical and religious roots. And, as I said at the start, Christianity begins as a cosmopolitan religion in part because of its Stoic inheritance, a connection that it shares, by the way, with Rabbinic Judaism. Equally obvious is the role of Greek philosophical traditions in shaping the philosophical traditions of Islam. But as I also said at the start, there's no reason to think that the impulse to cosmopolitanism comes solely from the Hellenistic world that produced Diogenes, or out of the West. After all, one of history's most cosmopolitan leaders was the 16th century Mughal emperor Jalaluddin Muhammad Appiah, a descendant both of Tamburlaine, the 14th century lord of Central Asia, and it is said of Genghis Khan, the 12th through 13th century Mongolian emperor. Cosmopolitanism, so it seems to me, is a temperament that is to be found on every continent. I learned it, as I said, not in England or America, but growing up in the cosmopolitan city of Kumasi. Well, I'll entertain questions if they're entertaining.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering, where do you draw the line on acceptance of diversity? It seems to me there's a big philosophical, ethical problem there, because certainly people in Saudi Arabia think it's perfectly normal for women to not essentially have any rights or to be stoned if they commit adultery. And to them, this is their culture. So how do you escape the kind of cultural relativism or ethical relativism, and how do you balance these things, and where do you draw the line?
Well, so I'm not any kind of relativist. I think that there are correct answers to these questions. So in particular, I think the Saudi view about the proper physical status of women is just incorrect. So now the question is, what's a useful and productive thing to do, given that I think that, and they think some of them think something different. My view is a useful and productive thing to do is to engage in respectful conversation with them, to notice that they're not monolithic in their views, that people in Saudi Arabia, like people in most places, have a range of opinions on these questions, that many Saudi women, for example, don't share the view that they're properly excluded from the public sphere and would like to see themselves having more role, and discuss. Where you have the power to stop someone doing something wrong that is sufficiently bad, do it. But we don't have the power to get women to vote in Saudi Arabia by any means that would involve reasonable human cost. I mean, we could send Marines, but I don't think the cost of human life and suffering, including the suffering of Saudi women, would make that a reasonable thing to do. So we have to do it some other way. And I'm urging on us a credible conversation about these things. But as I say, in the places where there's a sufficiently urgent danger to people, then if we have the power and the resources, I think we should try and protect them. Whether or not they're being attacked in the name of some tradition is irrelevant to the question whether that tradition is correct. The fact that something is done in the name of the culture doesn't give it any special privilege as a claim to truth. On the other hand, I'm fallibilist, and I think that we ought to inquire when we make judgments about these practices in other places, that we want to make sure that we really understand what we're talking about, and conversation with them is a good way to start. Many of the people who are most exercised, for example, about FGM, or female genital mutilation, or clitoral excision, or a number of practices in the world of that sort, turn out not to know very much about what's going on in the places where it happens, and they're not therefore very helpful in trying to get it stopped. So you need to inform yourself about these things, and sometimes in the course of informing yourselves, you'll come to see that things that look terrible to you are perhaps not as bad as they look from your point of view, or perhaps that they're worse than they look from the point of view of an ignorant person outside. So I think it's very important in engaging with these things, even if you start, as I do, with a sort of non-relativist notion, to make sure that you're well informed and that you're realistic about the forms of impact you can have. I think that respectful dialogue with people who disagree is one of the ways in which that those societies will change. If we're sort of offensive to them or hectoring, I'm not sure it'll help very much. That is a matter of tone in how we handle these differences. Let me qualify slightly the assertion that I'm not a relativist. I do think there are things that are in a certain sense relative, if you like. And that's this. I think that there are things where each person gets to decide for themselves whether something matters for them, and you can't correct them. If somebody has a vocation as a novelist, you may think that they don't have the talent for it, you might point that out. But suppose they do. Still, lots of people who have the talent to be a novelist aren't going to be novelists. And the ones, and when somebody chooses, opts for, settles into, finds themselves called by something, I think that's the second thought I said, the modern thought that each person has ultimate responsibility for their own life. I think there are aspects of human life which are, in that sense, relative. That is, what is good for somebody depends on what they are after. Now, given what they're after, I think there's an objective answer to the question, what's good for them? So I'm not a relativist, in the deep sense. But there is a way in which, I suppose you would call the view I just articulated, a kind of relativism, if you like. And if you called it a kind of relativism, I would say I didn't mind. But the deep relativism, the notion that there's sort of no fact of the matter and each society gets to make it up, or each person gets to make it up for herself, I think is a mistake. Is that helpful?
Yeah, so you're basically saying there is a universal moral code of some kind, whether it's natural law, religious, Christian, or whatever it is.
I mean, when we come into the global conversation, as cosmopolitans, we of course come with our own theories. So I have a fully developed view about human rights, but I don't make agreeing to that view a condition of entry into the conversation by other people. I offer it up in the conversation if I'm asked, or if it seems relevant. And just as my interlocutors offer up Confucian and Muslim and Catholic and Jewish and various kinds of Calvinist and Lutheran views about these matters, and secular views as well. People offer them all into the conversation. I think I find myself learning from all of them, though I obviously can't agree with all of them. And I have a view, and that's why I'm not a relativist. But I don't think agreeing to my view is a sensible thing to make as a condition of entry, as I say, into the conversation. For one thing, if I did, most people wouldn't come. And why should they? What are they going to gain from a conversation where I make all the rules? So I don't want to make all the rules because I want to have the conversation. But I do think there's this psychological fact that people who have engaged in this sort of way are in a better position to shape each other's behavior than people who sort of stand afar off in the mode of criticism. So even if you're just worried about being effective in changing these bad gender practices in many places in the world, I think a cosmopolitan conversation is the place to start. There was something over there, but maybe it was your question. So yes.
As I listened to your talk, I was trying to think of who in my personal friendship group, or anybody that I read about in the newspapers or in articles or in books, I would call a cosmopolitan. Do you have, I mean, your title is my cosmopolitan, but is your own particular understanding of what this is. Is there anybody that you admire because of they're agreeing with your cosmopolitanism in public life? Some of them we all know.
Well, that's a sort of question. I think the judge might call that a leading question.
Most questions are leading.
Well, yes. Look, I do think our current president is more cosmopolitan than his predecessor. But I would say more cosmopolitan than most of his predecessors. And this manifests itself in the thing that I think a cosmopolitan would always say to a national politician, which is, especially in a great and powerful nation, what you do doesn't just affect the people within your country. And because we have these background baseline obligations to all of humanity, because everybody in the world has a right to live a dignified human existence, you can't ignore the impact of what you do on people who don't happen to have a vote in the country that you are governing. And I think, I have the impression, let me back up a second. I did a program for the BBC World Service about President Obama, before he was President Obama. And one of the things I did was to go and talk to people who had known him as a student at Harvard and then as a colleague at the University of Chicago Law School. It was extremely interesting. And the most striking thing for me was, these were very distinguished people I talked to, Richard Epstein, Martha Nussbaum, Larry Tribe, all of whom had important contacts with him. And every one of them began by explaining that Obama really got something, which turned out to be the central intellectual idea of their life. so when I remember these things, and I wonder whether I'm not doing the kind of projection that I suspect they would do. Nevertheless, it does seem to me that in thinking about what we should do, there's a sort of background in which we ask not just what's good for America, but what's good for everybody. And that's that's a cosmopolitan thing. As I understand, they're going to make fairly soon an appointment of an ambassador to UNESCO, which took the previous president many years. That's another, I think, reflection of a concern for cultural cosmopolitanism, that is, for living in a world in which we exchange and learn from each other's culture, and also for the kind of multilateralism, which I think is a natural posture for someone of a cosmopolitan temperament. Maybe I should say, though, that there are, I want to distinguish between the universal demands of morality, which I think everybody is bound by, though I think they're less demanding than some people do. I think that they're best characterized, as I said, by saying that everybody has to do their fair share to make sure that everybody has a chance at a dignified human existence. There are people who think that we should do much more than that, but we aren't even doing that, so that's what I favour. So that's as it were obligatory. That's what everybody should do. But it seems to me that parts of cosmopolitanism are just, either you go for them or you don't. And sort of the cultural cosmopolitanism, the openness to other people, is a choice. I hate this expression, but it's a lifestyle, if you like. And when the Amish in Pennsylvania or in Ohio choose to close themselves off from the world for reasons or when a monastic order chooses to do so, they're also exercising a choice. It's not a very cosmopolitan choice, but it seems to me a perfectly legitimate one, and as long as they're doing their fair share to make sure that everybody on the planet has the basic chance of a shot at a good, decent human life, they're under no further obligation. I'm urging cosmopolitanism as an attractive option, as a way of being in the world, as a way of responding to our situation, but I'm not saying that I think it's morally required. What I think is morally required is the baseline set of obligations that are encapsulated in my slogan, in the universality part. The plus difference part is sort of what I'm urging, but I'm not saying that it's compulsory. So, having made that rather long, paraphrastic background explanation, I should say there are people I admire who are not remotely cosmopolitan. One of my favourite people in my hometown is, she's about 100 now, she's the Queen Mother of Asante, she's the mother of President King. Whenever I see her, she says to me, "So how are you?" I say, "Fine. How are things over there?" "Fine. Let me tell you what's going on here." She says, she's not a bit interested in the rest of the world. She knows the rest of the world is there. And she knows that people in her family, are interested in it, go out into it, but she doesn't care. What she really cares about is the little, I mean, it's millions of people, but it's still, there's only one kingdom. And she's not interested in anything else. Her life is entirely consumed with the sort of gossip and the life of the city that she lives in and of the Queen Mothers who are below her in the complex hierarchy all the way down to every village in the kingdom. And she knows what's going on. She doesn't tell me, but she knows who's sleeping with him, all kinds of stuff like that. And she's just, deeply embedded in one place. She's totally rooted in one place. That's an option that the cosmopolitan admires, as it were, because it's one of the ranges, it's one of the expressions of human diversity. It's the non-cosmopolitan option. So, as long as these people, as long as the non-cosmopolitan is not undermining the welfare of others, and is sort of doing their fair share of making it possible for others to live well, decent lives, that's fine by me. So I do admire, I do sort of find the cosmopolitan attractive, but I can see the attractions of kind of rooted life based in one tradition, one community. That's something that many, particularly religious people, commit themselves to. And I understand that, they feel that. And it's one of the choices that humans have. A legitimate choice.
Well, I get the sense, that what you're ascribing is most people that I know, whom I consider moral, ethical people who are trying to live a virtuous life, think and concern themselves with mostly about the gossip around her. I think that's how most people live their lives. And aside from Obama, well, I agree with you. I think as you were speaking, I was thinking, he's the cosmopolitan that I've heard of. And then I tried to say, who else? And I can't think of a single person.
Okay. Well, I can think of lots of people. I mean, but you don't know them. I mean, I got an email today from one of my former students who's in India. He's half American, half Indian. He's went to Andover and Harvard, but he lives in the commune in India now, and he's deeply engaged with the lives of many places on the planet. I think my friend and colleague Amartya Sen is a deeply cosmopolitan person, as is his wife, Emma, who's my cousin. So you know, I think there are more than you think. And I should say that some of the most cosmopolitan people I know are not privileged people. I've just mentioned a bunch of privileged people. There's a guy who grew up on the street that I grew up on, who didn't finish high school in Ghana and doesn't speak very good English. And English is the government language in Ghana, so you know that's a sign of not being a privileged person. It's easier to talk to him in our language, which is not true of most of the people that I grew up on the street. English is just as easy, or if not easier. He lives in Japan. He's got a Japanese wife and kid. And he was always open to the world, though he wasn't very rich and he wasn't very educated. And it's the merest luck that he managed to find his way to Japan. But he was excited about just seeing something else. And he loves his hometown, and he's made enough money in Japan that he can build himself a house in Kumasi and come back and bring his wife to his children to meet his relatives and so on. But he has brothers who never left and who are more like the Queen Mother. So it's a temperamental thing, and the temperament, as I say, is one that I think it's an attractive way to live in the modern world, but it's not obligatory. Yes, I should do something on this.
I just had one comment about your first answer, and subsequent answers seem to confirm it. Shouldn't this cosmopolitanism of yours be, in a sense, a requirement for ambassadors from our country? You haven't required anything of anybody, but I would require it of them.
Yes. Well, people who commit themselves to foreign service in this country, in the diplomatic service, not for example in the CIA, tend to be like this. They collect art when they go to other places. They collect art when the American ambassador to Ghana always comes home with a bunch of Ghanaian art. They go to cultural events in Ghana. They enjoy being there. They enjoy learning the cuisine and so on. It's the kind of temperament that makes it easier to be a foreign service officer, which is in some ways quite difficult. I would think it would be a very useful thing for someone to have as a temperament if they're going to do diplomacy, for us or for anyone. We have to remember that diplomats are representing all of us, and you can't be too distant temperamentally from the society that you're representing. So they can't, as it were, go native and still be good ambassadors. So you can go native and do lots of other interesting things, like become anthropologists or perhaps even good journalists about other places, but you can't be an ambassador if you go native.
So in a sense, what the First Lady asked you about the treatment of women in Saudi Arabia would not be at all the responsibility of our ambassador to Saudi Arabia to even broach the topic.
Well, I wouldn't think it was helpful for the American ambassador to Saudi Arabia to be known for being a bore at social occasions, which of course would consist only of men for him, and haranguing each one of them about women's rights issues.
He's not diplomatic, of course.
He can be diplomatic. Look, I think one of the things you have to understand about that world is that is how it looks from the point of view of its defendants, I think. And I have a friend, well, I had a friend, she's no longer alive, but she spent a lot of time with women in the Emirates, elite women, mothers of sheikhs mostly, and emirs and so on. And regularly, and because she was, she's actually American, which is a British citizen by the time this all happened. Because she was from the outside, she was also able to meet the men, which many women in that society didn't. They only met the men in their own family, they didn't meet men from other families. And she regularly found herself in the position of being asked by an emir or a sheikh to see if she could persuade his mother to allow him to do something or other, like move house. Because in the domestic world of those people, the mothers, the women have enormous, not the wives, but the mothers have enormous power. They basically decide all sorts of things. So if you ask them, if you talk to them, I'm not, this is not a defense, it's just an attempt to understand something. If you talk to them, they will say, why would we want to worry about all the things that our sons worry about? All the things that matter to us, all the things we care about, we're in charge of, and they have to get our permission to do them. They can't marry without, my son can't marry without my permission. He can't move house without my permission, so and he can't move out, he can't move me out of his house without, and so on. So there's usually some trade-off, as it were. There's, in worlds in which there's very visible gender hierarchy, there's also a separation of spheres, and within the woman's sphere, women get to do things that they like to do, that women like to do even in places where there's more equality with each other, and they're in charge of it, and they like that. And so, if you don't see what they're getting out of it, then you can't begin to argue about how the world would be better if they had some other arrangement, because you don't seem plausible. If you don't recognize what's good in their lives, simply banging on about the badness in their lives is not going to seem plausible. You have to begin by understanding how their lives make sense to them. And then you can talk to them about things like, well, maybe for your daughters, it might be, think of all the things that they could do if we changed this. But start from recognizing that there's something valuable in their lives, and they're not simply living lives of delusion and error and meaninglessness. And that's what I think a cosmopolitan engagement will produce. It will produce both the recognition of how their lives make sense, and also the capacity to make a better case for how you think things should change. And in the course of these conversations, one of the things that you will do is you will find that you are changed yourself, so the change will not all be going in one direction. You will find yourself thinking that there are attractive features of other societies, features that are, as we had once and lost, or perhaps that we never had. And we may not be able to get them because losing them was a condition of getting other good things. But that doesn't mean that they aren't good.
You talk about it as a one-way street, and what I'm thinking about as I ask my question is the two-way street aspect of it. I mean, how great if there's a cosmopolitan that meets another cosmopolitan, and they both have powers, but really magic happens, supposedly, in theory. So here's my question. You spent time in Ghana, and that's where I guess we first heard about the concept of Pan-Africanism. And today's news is that Colonel Gaddafi has been elected head of the African Union, and he wants to come in with this concept of Pan-Africanism. Is he a cosmopolitan? Will he listen and absorb all the different nations of Africa? And are Africans apt to be cosmopolitans coming back out? Where's this going?
Well, Gaddafi is it's very hard to figure out what he's up to. And most of what he's up to is sort of making his own life work. I don't know that he has any deep commitments to Africa or even to his own country. there are lots of people in Africa who, through Pan-Africanism, feel connected to the political life of societies other than the one of which they're citizens. And West Africans are following what's going on in Zimbabwe, as are people obviously in the surrounding countries, but the point is people in other parts of Africa which are not directly impacted. There are very few Zimbabwean refugees in West Africa. Unfortunately, there are some in practically every country in Africa. But most of the refugees from Zimbabwe are in Botswana and South Africa, Namibia, and Zambia. But, so those countries are directly impacted, but the point is there's an interest in these things in countries which are not directly impacted. That's a kind of sort of, as it were, continental cosmopolitanism. And you have to be somewhat open to other societies if you live in countries like Ghana, which is not by any means one of the biggest countries in Africa, but where there are, for example, 40 languages taught in the schools, and others that are not taught, but 40 main recognized languages, and where the average person speaks at least 3, namely English, because that's the government language, mother tongue, and usually, if their mother tongue isn't one of the big national languages, then one of the big national languages as well. So if your mother tongue is like mine, which is not the biggest, you don't bother to learn anybody else's language, just do English and tree. But everybody else learns 3. And many people speak French as well, because every country around us has French as an official language, and if you want to do French, not lycée French, streets French, but still enough French to trade goods and make deals and stuff. If you live in a society which is sort of deeply plural in culture, many of the West African societies, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Ghana, Ivory Coast, all have significant Christian and Muslim populations. Even Senegal, which is 95% Muslim, has a significant Catholic presence and had a Catholic president for the first 30, 40 years after independence. So, again, there's religious pluralism in the world religions. There's obviously diversity of languages and traditions and local religions. In such a context, someone who is made uneasy by difference is going to have a difficult life. So people tend to be able at least to handle it. And if you're able to handle it, one way of handling it is to take pleasure and be interested in it, and sort of mastering other people's things. And so what you see is exchanges of musical ideas, for example, both with recorded music from outside, from Asia and from Europe and from the Americas, but also with traditions in other parts of the region, drumming traditions, travel back and forth, singing traditions, and so on. So there's a kind of openness to others that's sort of a necessity. But I don't know what Count Gaddafi is up to. I suspect that Count Gaddafi very often doesn't know what Count Gaddafi is.
And mindful of the time, maybe we could have just one more question.
You mentioned Kant earlier. How does your thinking in this area overlay with Aristotle?
With Aristotle? Oh, gosh. Well, I'm most conscious of the things that I think Aristotle was wrong about, I have to say. So, for example, in this area, Aristotle thought that the ideal society was very small. And he thought it was very small, it had to be very small, because he thought that in order to live together, you had, as he said, to know the character of your fellow citizens. And he thought that you couldn't know the character of more than, I think the official number was 9,999. Anyway, that's fellow male citizens. Of course, they have wives and slaves, so the society might have 30,000, 40,000 citizens. Now, the presupposition of that you need to know deeply people in order to be successful fellow citizens with them, I just think we've discovered is not correct. The relationship that people have to fellow citizens in a successful modern nation state is not one of knowledge of each other's characters. Just because you couldn't do it